Hello and welcome. In this episode, I'm going to share encounters with more obscure cryptids, which include Indrid Cold, or the Grinning Man, and Thunderbirds. These stories include two very creepy, grinning men showing up in someone's home, a huge bird sighting outside someone's apartment building, and a Thunderbird sighting that includes a bit of the supernatural. But first, we start with a story from a married couple who saw something bizarre while driving in West Virginia one night. Alright, let's get into today's stories. The first story of this episode comes to us from a poster sharing a scary experience she had with her husband while driving through West Virginia on their way to Point Pleasant. For those who may not know, Point Pleasant was the site of the most famous sightings of the Mothman. However, this story is about an entity that is sometimes seen in areas where there have been Mothman encounters. The original poster, or OP, believes she and her husband saw this entity, Indrid Cold, also known as the Grinning Man or the Smiling Man, while driving to Point Pleasant. She took to the online community to post her story, she says, because some crazy coincidences lined up and she wanted some feedback on her experience. The OP and her husband were on what she calls a spooky road trip and found themselves in West Virginia, but more specifically in the Point Pleasant area. They had already explored the Mothman Museum and ventured into the depths of the TNT bunker at the nature reserve, but decided to go to Parkersburg for their final night. On their way back to the hotel, they took a detour from the main highway and found themselves on Route 2 heading back to Point Pleasant. It was already dark out, approximately 9 p.m. when they rounded a corner and saw an unexpected sight. There, leaning against the guardrail, stood a mysterious man. Both the OP and her husband were shocked to see someone standing there in the dark. As they passed him, the man smiled at them, with her saying she can't quite find the words to describe how unnerving the man's smile was. She says that typically when strangers smile, it's a polite grin and reserved gesture, but this man's smile was different. It was a wide, full-toothed grin that seemed unnatural. As they continued onward, they discussed how strange the situation was, with her husband speculating that the person they encountered might have been a drug user or had simply mistaken them for someone else. On the last day of their trip, she purchased a coloring book that was locally published called Mountain Monsters. As she flipped through the pages, she came across one featuring Indrid Cold. She asked her husband if he was familiar with a particular cryptid due to him being somewhat knowledgeable regarding them, but he had never heard of the Grinning Man. After a quick search, she discovered that Indrid Cold is also known as the Smiling Man and has been sighted in various locations, including New Jersey. What intrigued her most, though, were the sightings in Point Pleasant and Parkersburg, the very places they had just visited. She ends by asking if anyone else has had any experiences in that area. She also says she isn't saying she thinks for sure she saw Indrid Cold, but it was definitely a supernatural or paranormal experience and wants to start a discussion about her encounter. I think one of the last things I would want to see while driving at night is a man standing on the side of the road with an unnatural, unnerving grin waiting for me as I rounded a curve. I'd rather see Sasquatch or Dogman than that. I know that had to be terrifying. I've seen where Indrid Cold sightings can and do happen in the same areas where there have been Mothman sightings, so it doesn't surprise me that one would be hanging around Point Pleasant, West Virginia, where the most famous sightings of Mothman occurred. Not to mention, when she searched, she saw that there had been sightings in and around the city she had just visited and was driving between. I'm glad it was just a quick sighting and not something that continued to happen, but it must have been unnerving all the same to see that while driving at night. What do you think about this one? What would you do if you saw a man with a maniacal grin standing on the side of the road while driving at night? The next story is one of the most bizarre, creepy stories I have come across, with the encounter happening inside someone's home. This fact, at least to me, makes this one even more disturbing. The original poster and her daughter were the only ones at home at the time of the incident. The OP slept on the upper floor while her daughter's room was downstairs. Her bedroom spanned the entire top level of the house with just one staircase leading up or down. The room was lit by the glow of streetlights from the nearby corner outside. She had pleated shades popular in the early 2000s that she loved because they offered her privacy while still letting in plenty of light. Her daughter's room was situated near the stairs, so if she called out, her daughter could easily be heard. She points out here that the house wasn't very big. Her daughter's room was dimmer, but the fish tank she used as a headboard gave off some light. It was just a normal cool winter night in Florida. Her daughter had already gone to bed and they were both fast asleep by 11 o'clock. She had work the next day but couldn't recall if her daughter, who was in college at the time, had classes. At approximately 2 in the morning, she suddenly woke up. Not gradually, but as if something had startled her. It was almost as if she had heard a loud noise but only woke up after the noise stopped. As she was lying there tense, expecting something to happen, listening intently but hearing nothing, out of nowhere she suddenly got the urge to sit up. When she did, she found a man standing there. He was approximately 5'8" and was wearing a red plaid shirt tucked into blue jeans. He had on heavy dark shoes or boots and stood about 8 feet away from the foot of her bed, grinning widely. His arms were down by his sides and she could almost see him breathing. His grin was weird, almost maniacal, she says, as he stared directly at her. Upon seeing the man, she yelled, but he just stood there with that grin on his face. She says that she must have shut her eyes because when she opened them, he had vanished. That's when she heard her daughter shouting for her from downstairs. Her first thought was that the strange man had run down the stairs and was now in her daughter's room, but it had just been a few seconds between her yelling from downstairs and the man being in her bedroom. She knew there was no way he could have made it down the stairs that quickly. That's when she heard her daughter yell that there was a man in her room. The OP didn't waste any time leaping out of bed and dashing down the stairs. Her daughter was yelling the entire time, and when she burst into her bedroom, the man was gone. There were only 2 possible escape routes, past her and down the hall, which would lead to the front door or garage, or the sliding glass door in her daughter's bedroom. She asked her daughter which way he went, but she answers, still hysterical, that she didn't know. She ran down the hallway, turning on the lights in all the rooms, the living room, kitchen, and dining room, hoping to flush the weird man out. There was no trace of anyone anywhere though. Finally, she reached the front door and checked it, but it was still locked. After checking all the windows, which were all shut and locked, she checked the garage door and the sliding glass doors, all closed and locked. That only left the sliding glass door in her daughter's bedroom, so she ran back in there to find her crying with the lights still on. She quickly looked in both closets, but there was still nothing there. She went over and sat on the edge of the bed holding her daughter, both of them crying, and asked her to describe the intruder. Her daughter says it was a man in jeans and a plaid shirt grinning at her. The OP told her about her own terrifying experience, and that's when her daughter told her that she was already awake and seeing the man in her room when she heard her mother scream. They saw 2 men dressed identically with what she says were weird, 2 wide, fake-looking grins that were both menacing and cold. Both of the disturbing intruders disappeared without a trace. Luckily, neither of them have seen anything since the bizarre and unnerving encounters. She also adds that her and her daughter had also seen ghosts and were even robbed, but this was the scariest encounter that they had ever endured, because it was in their home. She ends her post by inviting anyone who's experienced anything similar to reach out, and if anyone has an explanation for what they saw, to please share. This is far from the first cryptid encounter I've heard where the creature is seen inside someone's home. Now I know that Indrid Cold is called the Grinning or Smiling Man, but he is still technically classified as a cryptid. However, I will say that this story does have a paranormal supernatural feel to it, as both the OP and her daughter saw the exact same thing at the exact same time. Then both entities vanished into thin air. None of the doors or windows were ajar or even tampered with, which is baffling. Honestly, if it was just one of them, I might well think it was just a bad dream or hallucination. But for both of them to experience seeing someone standing in their rooms watching them with an unnerving maniacal grin makes me think that there's definitely something to it. Unfortunately, I don't have an explanation except to say what she describes does fit with Indrid Cold or the Grinning Man. I'm just glad they never saw anything again and nothing else happened that night. What do you think about this one? Did the OP and her daughter have simultaneous Indrid Cold encounters? The next story comes from Ontario, Canada back in December of 2011. The original poster lived in Mississauga at the time. It was somewhere between 2 and 4 in the morning when the encounter took place, with the OP, his brother, and their friend stepping out onto the balcony of their apartment to smoke a certain substance. The apartment was on one of the upper floors near the middle of the building. As they lit their joint, the OP noticed a dark silhouette moving atop one of the willow trees near his building. He got his brother and friend's attention, urging them to look and help him decipher what this thing could be. At first glance, it appeared to be a huge black tarp swaying gracefully in the breeze. However, as their gazes remained fixed on this thing, the true nature of this creature slowly materialized before their very eyes. Wings, a neck, and the unmistakable form of a bird came into focus before them. The creature continued to roam the uppermost branches of the willow tree. This story takes place in a time, according to the OP, when cell phones had absolutely terrible night support cameras. The boys attempted to capture videos of this thing, whatever it was, zooming in on it, but it only resulted in horrendous, grainy footage. The three of them then hurried down to the ground floor. He says that the mere presence of this creature froze their souls, as they couldn't believe their eyes. He said the effects of the marijuana had long since faded, replaced by a natural high he didn't know he could achieve. His brother and their friend exited the building and got 6 feet away from the door before stopping, not mentally prepared for what they were seeing. They stumbled over each other, eyes fixed on the tree. The creature was truly terrifying, he says, especially knowing he shared the same reality with it, as well as knowing it's a real, living, breathing creature. The OP then decided to move closer to the tree, stopping about 5 feet away. He couldn't go any further as the enormous bird let out a shriek that was so intimidating and loud. He describes it as sounding like an eagle on steroids, but with a much deeper and sharper pitch. He vividly recalls the moment when the bird crouched down with its tail up, head charging downwards, wings halfway open and curled upwards. It was all black with red feathers near its face. The fear he felt in that moment, he says, was unlike anything he had ever experienced before. He quickly turned and ran back to his brother and friend, with the bird growing more restless and aggressive. It flapped its wings, hopped up onto the next building, which was about 4 stories high, beside the willow tree that stood approximately 7 stories, with less than 15 feet between the tree and the building. The bird paced around agitated before flying off and disappearing. The creature's wingspan was definitely more than 16 feet according to the OP, and it stood at around 8 to 10 feet in height. He mentions that many people encounter cryptids alone and that he was fortunate enough to share his extraordinary experience with 2 other people. They decided to share their story with a few of their friends, and much to their surprise, they actually believed them. After his encounter, he became completely consumed by the need to find answers, to unravel the mystery behind this creature. He even contemplated reaching out to the authorities responsible for overseeing birds and wildlife, but he didn't want them to dismiss him as crazy or dishonest. However, he did manage to stumble upon some valuable information that shed light on the Thunderbird and helped him make sense of his encounter. Just like with many others who post their cryptid encounters online, this young man did so because he hadn't been able to tell anyone outside of his immediate friends and needed to share his story with others because he had been carrying it around for such a long time. He ends by saying he feels like the Thunderbird he saw had adapted to night and being nocturnal, so that's why he hadn't seen it during the day. If I saw something like that in a tree, I'm pretty sure the last thing I would do was go running out to try to get a better look at it. Those boys are lucky they didn't get hurt or worse. But to see something that big, I guess, would be intriguing enough to try to get a closer look and to take a picture. But after everything I've heard in these encounters, it's best to keep your distance from cryptids. I'm hoping they learned that lesson when it dove at them. But what a sight that must have been from the balcony to see something that big that isn't even supposed to exist. And then to see it hop up onto a 4-story building like it was nothing. Cryptids are usually said to be strong, with stories of them picking up very heavy objects with ease or even jumping really high or far, so it's no surprise to me that a bird that size would be able to do so. What do you think about this one? What would you have done if you saw a giant bird in a tree from your balcony? The final story of this episode comes to us from a poster who saw something extraordinary while visiting his parents who live on the Shenandoah River. The Shenandoah River runs through Virginia and West Virginia, spanning 55.6 miles or 89.5 kilometers, and is the main tributary of the Potomac River. The original poster does not say which state his encounter took place in. I will say that this story is borderline paranormal, but I've often talked about on this channel how cryptids seem to be both physical and supernatural beings. That said, I'll let you make up your mind what you think happened here. This story takes place 2 weeks before he posted it online at approximately 11 o'clock at night. It was the day after Thanksgiving and they had returned to the river. He mentions before getting into his story that he had seen some unusual lights while at the river house. He describes them as being green, blue, and red flashing lights that happened very fast. Upon returning to the river that night, he and his girlfriend decided to spend some time on the home's dock. About 10 minutes later, his girlfriend spotted something peculiar moving swiftly along the river. Intrigued, he followed her gaze and caught sight of it too. It was an enormous bird with dark plumage and white outlying feathers. These white feathers, he says, emitted a faint glow, leaving behind a misty trail akin to smoke. He likens the sight to a ghostly apparition or a phantom. The bird flew at such a high speed he describes it as looking like a rocket having been launched. He could tell it noticed them as it changed its course and began heading straight toward them. The huge bird then abruptly dove into the ground, not the water he specifically points out, and vanished into thin air, dissipating like smoke. They immediately turned and ran back to the porch, and that's when things took a bizarre turn. A mysterious light resembling a star or a fractal pattern hovered in the middle of the river. Orbs of light then began appearing and disappearing around it. And strangely, one of the orbs kept appearing over his grandfather's house, who lived next door. He says it seemed like the lights were somehow communicating with each other, which created a strange energy at the scene. He then watched as one of the orbs transformed into a triangle before reverting back to its original form. Toward the end of the yard there was a fire pit with the fire dying down and just a few embers remaining. Suddenly flames erupted from the pit, growing more intense by the second. The star on the river also intensified, almost as if drawing energy from the fire. He then noticed how strange the lights were in the neighborhood. Each light, whether from a house or a street lamp, seemed to be as bright as a spotlight according to him. They were all shining intensely, much brighter than usual. And to top it off, their electronics began to act up. Flashlights wouldn't work when they pointed them in certain directions, but as soon as they turned to shine them elsewhere, they worked perfectly fine. He says he is positive he saw a thunderbird that night, but does say it perhaps could have been a hologram or projection. He knows it wasn't an ordinary owl or any living bird, as they don't simply vanish into a plume of smoke. This creature he saw was enormous, bigger than any bird he has ever seen. It looked like, according to him, a flying phantom about the same size as a flying dinosaur. He ends by saying that describing the encounter properly seems impossible because it defied all logical explanation, convincing him he saw an extraordinary phenomenon or perhaps a top-secret research experiment, but maybe a mixture of both. As I said in the intro to this story, it definitely leans into the supernatural as it continues on, but I decided to include it in this episode because the giant bird he describes does resemble those from other Thunderbird stories. The sighting and the creatures do match other encounters as well. The rest of the encounter, though, certainly seems paranormal or supernatural to me. What makes me think that are the orbs he saw and the electronics malfunctioning. This happens a lot during these types of encounters. I find it interesting that we get a cryptid encounter and a paranormal supernatural encounter in one because I do believe cryptids have a supernatural element to them. They are able to be there 1 second and gone the next, how fast they are said to be, and how strong they are usually described. This, though, is taking it to a whole new level, and I'm not really sure what to make of it. I've never heard of anything like this happening before. What do you think about this one? Do you think it was a Thunderbird or something else? And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.